Hey everybody, we are back. Several months ago, my wife and I were walking outside our house, and she was telling me about all the things that she hated about our yard. And one of the things she mentioned was this log that we had sitting next to the fire pit that had been left by the prior owners. I thought it was great because, man, what better seating can you have around a fire pit than a log? But she did not think it looked nearly as good as I did. And so I took a chainsaw and cut that log into 4 slabs. This is one of the slabs that resulted. And you can see on this back side that I did not get a very smooth cut with my chainsaw. Got quite a few gouges. My chain wasn't in great shape. I had to replace it, and it worked a lot better after that. But up until then, yeah, I mangled it quite a bit, right? And so after that, I got one of these hand planers from Harbor Freight for cheap, and on the seating surface, tried to flatten it as best I could. And on two of the 4 slabs, I got it relatively flat like this. One of them, it was pretty bowed, and so I didn't really even try to truly flatten it. I just tried to, mostly smooth it out. These guys had quite a bit of rot in some places, and so, whoa, careful. So I ended up having to dig out quite a bit of that rot, and so you can see this is kind of what resulted. I just used an angle grinder with a flap disc to remove anything that wasn't very solid. So this is what remained. After that, I made a kind of a homemade filler, and basically just got some sawdust from my vacuum receptacle here using the dust stopper deal, and mixed it with the glue, and then just put on some rubber gloves and stuffed it into the areas that were much lower. And because I used that method, you can see that everywhere that I filled is a lot darker than the wood around it. And so, that's kind of a mistake. I should have done something to make it more similar in color to the original workpiece. But, you make mistakes, you live and you learn. Another big mistake I made on the filler is that I didn't really let it set long enough because I was a little too anxious to move on to the next step in my process. And so, probably was only an hour or two after putting the filler in that I was like, oh, that's probably good enough. So I started sanding it, and that I ended up losing a fair amount of the filler, and perhaps even more important, it didn't really fill, and so I still had kind of holes going through to deeper parts into the wood. So my next step was epoxy. Right, so I had some leftover epoxy from stone coat countertops, and because we had done countertops with epoxy, and so I tried to do it the same way on here that I had done on the countertops, which was basically put a tape dam around the exterior. Right, so you just get tape and just put it around like that, so you've got a border. So that keeps the epoxy on the workpiece, right? And so that was the intent. and it worked pretty well to keep the epoxy on, except for the holes that were prevalent kind of all around the workpiece. And so a fair amount of epoxy leaked off. And then the other big problem was that this is not a countertop, right? And so it is a very different type of surface. And so on the countertop, it just kind of self-levels and, then solidifies and everything's great. And then there's a fly, which is amazing. Love flies. Anyway, so I took the epoxy, poured it on, just let it set with the tape dam. Eventually, after the epoxy had set a little bit, I removed the tape dam so then the epoxy could flow over the edges. But there was just areas that, really soaked in the epoxy and ended up really dry afterwards, and other areas where it didn't take much epoxy at all. And so it ended up, being, clear as glass in those sections. So it had a really inconsistent finish after that round of epoxy. And I was really disappointed with how it was looking. And so I ended up, kind of sanding over that layer of epoxy and doing another layer of epoxy. So this time I poured it on. It was a fair amount of epoxy that I poured on, but I used a 4-inch roller and, kept rolling that epoxy, throughout the period of it drying. And so what that did, it was much more effective that way. So I was able to take epoxy from areas that it was pooling and move it and redistribute it into areas that was soaking it up. And so that way I was able to get much better coverage and much smoother coverage all the way across the workpiece. Then after letting that epoxy set, and actually getting the legs on, I guess I haven't talked about that part yet, but after the epoxy set and after I got the legs on, then I sprayed it with polyurethane, and that should protect it from the UV rays. So let me tell you about the legs. The legs I just fashioned from some firewood that we had in the firewood pile out by the fire pit, and I cut tenons into one end of each of these legs, and basically just chiseled away some of the exterior, and then cut the mortises into the bench piece and glued them in, right? But I didn't get a great fit, and so there was a bit of a gap in places at the base. And so last week I was taking this piece to this church activity where we were showcasing our talents, right? So I was taking this along with one of the others of the four. And as I was taking this one through the gate, there's the fly again, this leg snapped off. And so I was a little disgusted when dropped it back by the fire pit, went over, grabbed the leg, threw it back over near the workbench, or I'm sorry, near the bench, and then only took the one piece to the activity. So that was a little disappointing. So I've decided, instead of trying to do another mortise and tenon setup on this guy, because I don't have enough length on him now to cut a tenon and put him in, I'm doing now what I probably should have done originally, which is just using a dowel. And so I just cut a 3/4 inch wide dowel and using that to connect. And then, because I don't want any of these snapping off again, I made some more of my homemade filler with the sawdust, and put on some rubber gloves, and then just packed that filler around the base of each of these legs, and really shoved it in there so that I've got more support all the way around each of the legs. So hopefully they don't actually break off anymore. that is my goal. So anyway, I'm just waiting for that to set, and yeah, then it should be ready to go back out by the fire pit. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas on how to do this better, either next time or for anyone else who's watching, feel free to leave that in the comments below. And thanks for joining me, and see you next time.